Good evening. I'm Delmarie Cobb, and welcome to Promote the Vote, the Fair Tax. Ida's Legacy, the state's first political action committee focused on progressive Black women candidates, and the Independent Voters of Illinois Independent Precinct Organization are sponsors of tonight's panel. We're proud to join IVI-IPO again to host this important panel on the fair tax. Illinois residents are being bombarded with political ads for and against the proposed fair tax amendment, which would change the state's income taxation from a flat tax to a graduated tax. This change to the state's constitution requires 60% of voter support to pass. With election day only 8 days away and early voting underway already, many residents still don't know whom to believe. The state's wealthiest residents are putting millions into ads to convince voters that passage for the fair tax would be a slippery slope that would hurt working families, small business owners, and seniors. Governor J.B. Pritzker ran on this issue and has given Vote Yes for Fairness, the group backing the proposed tax amendment, $56.5 million to persuade voters it's unfair that billionaires pay the same rate as regular people. Meanwhile, hedge fund billionaire Ken Griffin has donated close to $54 million to the Coalition to Stop the Proposed Tax Hike Amendment to convince voters that Illinois should remain one of a handful of states with a flat tax rate. So far, more than 1.8 million Illinois voters have either voted or turned in their mail-in ballots. Tonight's panel is to educate the remaining voters on the fair tax amendment. Our interactive Promote the Vote panel is one of the last opportunities for you to get all of your questions answered about the flat tax. Joining me tonight is IVI-IPO's State Chair, Joseph Michael Carr, who is going to join us a little bit late, and former U.S. Senator Roland Burris, and Ralph Materi, Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, a bipartisan think tank committed to ensuring the state, federal, and local workforce, education, fiscal, economic, and budget policies are fair and just. He's also a professor at Roosevelt University, where he teaches tax policy. Before Roland Burris was a senator, he was the state's comptroller for 3 terms and attorney general for 1 term. He was a candidate for governor 3 times. Both of our panelists have had legislative successes in Springfield, and both are expert on budget policies. So hello, gentlemen.
How are you doing, Delmarie?
The 3 of us go back a long way. We've been in the trenches for years on these issues. For some people who don't know, a fair tax or progressive tax as we know it is something we've been advocating for years. What's really changed this time around is having a governor who can self-fund to make it happen. I want to ask both of you to explain why Illinois should go from a flat tax to a graduated tax. And Ralph, I'll let you go first.
Well, let's start with tax policy. So different taxes play different roles, right? Income tax has 2 jobs. Job number 1, literally offset the regressivity of every other tax and fee state and local government assessed. Because every other tax, sales tax, excise taxes, fees, are regressive. They take more of the income of a lower moderate earning family than an affluent family. So the only tax, literally the only tax that can be designed to offset that is an income tax, but not if it has a flat rate, because that doesn't offset anything. It needs to have a graduated rate structure where it can assess higher rates at higher levels of income to offset this regressivity, shift some tax burden away from low and middle income families and push it onto more affluent families. So that's job 1, which you can't do if you're required to have a flat tax. Job 2, and this is crucial, is to respond to how incomes are actually distributed in the modern economy. Now, I'm going to give you the Illinois specific data here, and it's kind of eye-opening. Between 1979 and 2017, according to what folks in our state reported to the IRS on their tax returns, the average income of the wealthiest 1% went up from $411,000 a year to $1.4 million a year over that sequence. It's an increase of 254%. For the bottom 99%, the average income went up from $51,000 to $61,000. So you have, and this is all inflation adjusted, so you have this incredible growth in income inequality. No tax can respond to that except the income tax. And then only if it has a graduated rate structure where it could assess higher rates on higher levels of income. And because our income tax can't do that, it fails to generate adequate revenue growth over time. Why? We're not taxing where the economy's growing. And that's a huge problem. And it's really one of the main driving reasons Illinois has had deficit after deficit after deficit. We have structural problems with our tax policy. It's not about overspending, it's about bad tax policy. So let's fix this. Let's get this amendment passed. Let's get this new legislation implemented so we could actually use the income tax for its intended purposes.
And Roland, you know a little bit about this. What is your thoughts on this?
Well, Delmarie, I go back to the 1970 Constitution when they had to put this, it was a major compromise as to how they were going to deal with the income tax in that 1970 Constitution. And the compromise with the flat tax being the same for all individual taxpayers. And of course, that was what, 50 years ago? And that has just caused us to be stagnated in terms of our ability to tax individuals as their net worth grew and as their income grew. Our tax dollars was not growing proportionally. Naturally, if you make $1 million a year this year and you pay your flat 4.95%, okay, then you make $2 million next year, you'll pay a little bit more, but it would not deal with the amount that you had growth in income proportional to what someone else is paying who only made $20,000 a year, and then they made $30,000 the next year. So I think that we have to balance this out. And this is what's been missing from all of the promotions and the money that's been spent on these negative commercials saying, what all this is going to do. Look, we've always had an income tax. The federal income tax has been graduated and the state income tax was flat. So this is nothing new to a taxpayer in terms of based on the percentage of income earned that you would pay a higher percentage if you earn higher income. So therefore, if you're at a higher income, you're still paying a flat 4.79%, 975%. So therefore, we must adjust this. And based on that, having been for tax increases, when I was state controller, having fought tax increases, having dealt with the spending of the state and watched how we were up one year and down the next year, it's really been a problem for the governors to come forth. Fortunately, we've had a governor who, by the way, is going to get hurt by this because he is a billionaire. And this tax is going to definitely impact him, and some of his colleagues and fellow billionaires are fighting him, but he has the overall interest of the people of Illinois at heart and not his own personal interest. And what they're seeking to do is to try to protect their own personal interests so they can have many more dollars for whatever they want to deal with in the higher income brackets. So therefore, we must come up with a plan. And the legislature has, and they've even passed a law of how this would work. But Delmarie and all the listeners, I listen to these commercials and they say, well, they're going to tax your pension. The Illinois can always tax your pension. They can always raise the income tax. And so this is nothing new. What we're doing is changing the Constitution so we can put some balance in those who earn a great deal, who will pay a great deal, and those who earn less will pay.
And Roland, I'm going to give you some of those commercials to have you and Ralph actually address some of the things that have come out of the commercials, because what's interesting is a lot of what they're saying is true. It's just, it sounds so ominous when they say it that it's like, oh my God, I can't believe they're doing that. So,
right.
So I mentioned earlier that
actually, Delmarie, I wouldn't say a lot of what they're saying is actually true.
Right.
I think these ads are intentionally misleading, and they contain many canards and not only half truths, but outright lies. I think
That's
the
right, Ralph.
senator hit the one on the retirement tax, right? I mean, there is absolutely nothing in either this constitutional amendment nor the implementing legislation that would create the new rate structure if the amendment is ratified that creates any new right or authority to tax retirement income that does not exist today. You know, Roland Burrs hit that on the head. They keep making it sound as if passage of the amendment and or this rate structure somehow creates some new authority to tax retirement income. No, it does not. And in fact, the AARP, you ever hear of that organization, the ARP, who has as one of its core principles never allowing the taxation of retirement income in Illinois, fully supports the fair tax initiative.
Ralph,
Now, what do you think that would be?
Ralph, I would like to see a legislator putting forth a bill to tax retirement income. They tried to put forth a bill to change how they pay our pensions, how they pay out the pensions, and they couldn't get that going. So if a legislator put that forward, well, they did until they found out that it was unconstitutional, that you just cannot make those changes. But the legislator put that forward that they're going to tax the pensions. He might as well just hang his coat up, going home, because these pensioners in the state of Illinois will run him definitely out of office.
Well, I'm going to go over some of them with you, some of the things that stood out, and I'd like for the two of you to address them. So I mentioned earlier that the fair tax, you need 60% to pass. And obviously, those who can poll and afford to poll are polling, which explains why there's so many commercials being run right now about the fair tax. So here's a couple of things from the ads. They say it's only a tax on the rich. When that's not enough, they're coming after me next.
All right, so let me handle that, because we looked at this is the camel's nose under the tent argument, right? So if they get the right to have a graduated rate structure, sure, this structure is really good for middle income families, low income families, but you just wait. The second they have the right to do any rate they want, they're going to raise taxes on everyone. So it's complete fear tactic, number one. And number two, it's actually not based on any evidence. We looked at all the states in America that have an income tax. So 41 states have an income tax. Of those 41, 32 have a graduated rate structure, and 9, including Illinois, have flat taxes. All right. So we went back the last few decades and said, all right, do these states with graduated rate structures just go nuts raising taxes on the middle class? And the answer is they don't. So over the last few decades, if you were a middle income person living in a state that had a graduated rate structure, there was an 80% likelihood there would be no change to your taxes at all. 80%. 13% of the time they changed rates to cut your taxes. Yes, 5% of the time they actually raised taxes on everyone, including the middle class. And 2% of the time they raised taxes, but only on the wealthiest, which means if you lived in one of these states, it's really unlikely your tax rate would be changed. But if it was changed, it's more than twice as likely to have your taxes cut than increased. And this is why I say these ads, they run them to play to people's fears that they can't point to any evidence to support their arguments. Now, interestingly, Delmarie, you probably have heard them talk about this. They talk about Connecticut all the time as this bad state that raised taxes. It accounts for that 5%. Connecticut is the outlier. If you have to make your case predicated on the one state that doesn't act like the 31 others, maybe you don't have much of a case.
And you actually addressed the next commercial, which is I'm doing pros and cons. So the next one was middle class is carrying the bulk of the taxes. 97% will get a tax cut. And you sort of addressed that in fact, it will help the majority of the taxpayers in the state.
Yeah, there'll be a tax cut for 97%. It's not a huge amount of tax relief. And so we should be clear about that. The major thrust of this legislation, and let's talk about the two pieces. What's called the fair tax is really the implementing legislation. The amendment just allows you to have a graduated rate structure. You could still have a flat rate structure even after the amendment goes into place. It's just up to the legislature to pick. They've picked on a bipartisan basis, by the way, this new rate structure, which is graduated. And so that's the fair tax. And it does cut the income tax burden for 97.
Marie, what you also must remember on your first question is that they said they're going to come after you. Well, they could have come after you without a new fair tax. So, I mean, they can raise tax. The legislature can raise the taxes in a year that they can get the bill passed and get the governor to sign it. The only thing is it had to be proportionate to the income, or and then under the Constitution, then it has to have that separation between the corporate income tax rate and the interpersonal income tax rate. But they could always raise your taxes. So they got this commercial going that they're going to come after you. And what I think the lieutenant governor said this, that if they don't get that adjustment, they can just pass a tax increase that will hit everybody. And so they can raise it from the 4.75% or 4.95?
4.95.
4.95.
Currently it's 4.95, and they can certainly raise it to 6 point, because I fought it when they raised it to 3 point, and I fought for only temporarily. I had the legislature to raise the income taxes during the 1982 fiasco with the spending, only for it actually went for 2 years. So they raised it from the 3%, I think, to 3.5%. I don't remember the specific numbers, but the legislature could already raise your rate on your income tax.
And we've seen that with Governor Pat Quinn. And then when Rauner got into office, he lowered it.
And Del Marie, the difference is, though, if you don't get the graduated rate structure something that you could use, then if they do raise the income tax, it has to be on everyone, including middle income. I mean, their argument is so illogical. Under current law, the legislature has no option but to increase taxes on everyone because they have a flat rate income tax. Only if we get this amendment ratified and then this new rate structure, but in future rate structures, can they design any tax increase to skip low income earners, middle income earners, focus solely on the wealthy, like you're supposed to do with your income. And I would say that that's the main gist of this legislation is it raises revenue. It doesn't provide a ton of tax relief, but it does shift tax burden from the bottom and middle to the top. And that's the job of the income tax. So it's a really good piece of legislation. It would raise about 3.6 billion in new revenue if we had a non-COVID-19 economy. We have a COVID-19 economy, but it's not going to raise significantly less revenue. And that's because if you look at the destruction created by COVID-19, 30% of the jobs in the bottom two wage quintiles have been lost, whereas only 5% of the jobs in the top wage quintile. So really, the jobs being lost are middle income jobs and low middle income jobs. They're not affluent jobs. And so even with COVID-19, this legislation in a full year would generate around $2.7 billion in new revenue, 2.8. And then when the economy turns around, it'll go back up to 3.6 billion.
And Ralph,
that's
that will not
revenue the state really needs. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Roland.
But that would not cover the shortfall that we're looking at based on COVID, because I'm pretty sure that given what COVID has cost this state, and we don't know whether or not we're going to be able to get any relief from the federal government because there's still a stalemate in Washington. So therefore, that $3 billion shortfall is going to be I think going to be closer to $6 billion that we're really going to have to have a problem with.
Well, the estimates now are about 4.8, so call it 5 billion in revenue loss for the current fiscal year.
Yeah.
That revenue loss at the state level is being covered by a loan that the Illinois state government is going to get under one of the federal relief programs this year. And so that gives us 5 billion to plug the gap. And really, when you're talking about long-term structural fiscal changes, they have to be done with a mind towards your long-term structural problems, not trying to fill short-term interim gaps. I think whatever they have to do to get through the short term for COVID-19 should be short-term answers, whether it's borrowing, whether it's a temporary tax increase on some little thing, whether it's some cutting of spending, although I do think spending cuts are a very bad thing to do from an economic standpoint. We can talk about that later, Del Marie.
Right.
But the bottom line is this is needed for the long-term structural deficit the state of Illinois has. It's probably one of three core fiscal reforms the state of Illinois needs to do. It needs to re-amortize its pension debt. It needs to expand its state sales tax base to include consumer-only services. If it did those three things, within 5 to 7 years, you can completely eliminate the state's structural deficit. And actually, Del Marie, that gets to some of the silly stuff they say in the ads, because this doesn't fill the entire shortfall, there's going to be more tax. Well, first of all, if you are in a hole and you want to stop going down, the first thing you do is stop digging. Yeah, right? You stop digging. So the income tax isn't going to solve all our problems. And even every supporter of the fair tax acknowledges it doesn't solve all our problems. But just because it doesn't solve all our problems doesn't mean it isn't crucial. It is literally one of the three big things the state has to do to get its fiscal house in order. So if we don't do this, I think the lieutenant governor was right when she said the state's going to have to increase the income tax on everyone because they really need that $3.6 billion in a normal economy to fill the structural gap. And if you just look at our current rate structure and what it generates, an increase from about 4.95% where we currently are to about 6% would generate about $3.6 billion in revenue. So that's what you're talking about, a point or a point and a quarter or 0.5 increase in the income tax rate for everyone, as opposed to an income tax increase that just hits the wealthiest 3% in our state. And I want to talk about them for a second, because they can afford it. And let me tell you how I know they can afford it. First of all, there's only 189,000 of them out of 6.2 million tax returns filed in Illinois.
Cutoff, Ralph? What's your cutoff in terms of?
Well, you start possibly paying more at about $275,000 of taxable income, because even when you just get north of $250,000 of taxable income, you're still probably going to be paying less because you get the benefit of the graduated rate structure below. These are the wealthiest 3% in our state, and let me tell you how wealthy they are. The last year that I have a year-to-year change in their income was from federal data, what they reported to the IRS, right, on their income tax returns. In that 1 year, between 2016 and 2017, the incomes of the wealthiest 3% in Illinois went up by $16 billion after taxes. 1 year, $16 billion after taxes.
They can't afford it. They can't afford it.
So if this law was in place then, Roland, their incomes would have only grown by $12.4 billion. I'll start passing the hat to help them out. I mean, it's just because we've had such tremendous growth in income inequality, and our tax structure doesn't respond to that. We've had major fiscal problems, and this is a tax that literally the people who will pay more could certainly afford it. Governor Pritzker, I love him for supporting this, but he could afford to pay more, as could Ken Griffin, as could former Governor Rauner, Uline, all these millionaires, naked billionaires. They could certainly afford it, especially when you look at their actual income trends over time. It's just eye-opening.
And based on what you just said a little bit earlier, given the deficit, given the impact of COVID-19, where those workers on the bottom have been the ones to suffer, and those on the top have not suffered quite as much, if at all. And so that is where you would want to get the income from, because they can afford it. Even in a pandemic, they can afford it. Well, you've addressed most of them, but one of the other commercials is businesses will flee the state.
Well, no.
Roland, you go first. I'll go second.
That has been a major canard for years, that they're gonna move to Indiana, as you generally always hear. They're gonna move to Wisconsin, and Illinois has the infrastructure and the what we call the crossroads to cause industry to want to locate here in the state. It is all the natural facilities for business to come. And that's how you've been able to attract companies and headquarters here, especially in Chicago or in our suburban community. And naturally, we lost population, but it's been individual population. And I don't think it's been corporate population, or either, except for the big move that we had of corporations taking their manufacturing to China. You know, that's been the biggest issue. They have not necessarily left this jurisdiction because the tax revenues continue to grow and the companies continue to prosper. And being centrally located in Illinois for their distributions and for all of their various other costs, it's a wonderful place to do business.
Yeah, so once again, everything Roland said is 100% right, like Roland usually is. So let's give him credit where credit is due.
But you got all the numbers and the facts, Ralph. So
Okay, call me out for being a nerd, Roland. That's okay. It is. I've come to grips with the fact that I am at this point in my life. I'm okay with it. So let me just talk about migration and tax policy to begin with. There's never been a peer-reviewed study that has ever found any statistically meaningful correlation between tax policy and migration, or generally, or tax policy and job growth, or tax policy and economic growth. So literally everything they're saying is fear-mongering. It is not based on any evidence at all. But let's talk about both of these phenomena. First, let's talk about just migration, right? Because they say people are going to leave, millionaires are going to leave, not just businesses, right? Everybody's going to leave. Well, first of all, everybody does leave Illinois already. Since 1920, Illinois has had out-migration on a net basis every single year except one. This is just a great state to leave at some point or another. But all kidding aside, our out-migration rate is around the national average at about 2% a year. We're just a very big state. We're the 6th most populous state in America. So of course we will have negative net out-migration to smaller states because they have fewer people to move into our state, right? So if 2% of our population moves out and 2% of Indiana's population moves out, 2% of our population is a much bigger number. So that's just why we have net out-migration every year. But interestingly enough, we went back the last decade. In the last decade, 1.6 million people left Illinois to move to states that had higher income taxes than Illinois, higher. Only 1.2 million Illinoisans over that same period moved to states that had lower income taxes or no income taxes, like Florida and Texas. So significantly more people moved to higher tax states. And this sort of really disproves that silliness that there's any correlation between tax policy and migration. But on economics, I just have to say, so let's go back to, there are 41 states in America with an income tax, which means 9 do not, right? Of the 9 states that don't have an income tax, you have a lot of these quote unquote miracle states economically that the anti-tax people always talk about. Texas and Florida and Nevada and North Dakota. Gee, don't you wish our economies could be as good as these no tax economies? Well, our economies are better if you're talking about high tax economies. We went back the past decade and we compared 4 different major economic items. And these are the 4 major economic items. Number 1, GDP growth per capita. Much higher in the 9 states in America that have the highest income tax rates than in the 9 states in America with no income taxes. And it's 9.7% to 2.9%. Then we looked at, all right, how about personal income? That grew by 34.8, so call it 35% in the high tax states, and it only grew by 29% in the no tax states, higher. More importantly, how about your after-tax income? What you have left after the tax man takes it away? Higher in the high tax states. That grew by 35% in the high tax states and only 30% in the no tax states. So then personal consumption, and this is the key point, was up by about 33% in the high tax states and only 29% in the no tax states. And personal consumption is what drives the economy. The economy is 67% consumer spending. In other words, the high tax states had much better economies over the last decade than the miracle no tax states, including Texas and Florida and Nevada and North Dakota. So they need to stop making these arguments about jobs and the economy and a correlation with taxes, because there is none.
And Ralph, you have to keep in mind on the high tax states, I mean, the no tax states, what does Texas have? It has the oil revenue where it gets all its income.
Sure.
What does
Sure.
Florida have? It has the tourist activity that they get their revenue from.
It's got
So-
a really famous mouse.
And that brings in billions of dollars into that Florida economy, and it's the tourism. And I got so many, personal friends of people that I know that moved to Florida. Of course, I tell them you got to fight all the other elements down there. It ain't just no taxes.
Have you seen those palmetto bugs in Florida, by the way?
Yeah. So
Those suckers are big. They will knock you out. They are large.
Of course, a lot of the members, especially some blacks, have been moving to Houston, and they're finding that it is no better off in Houston, because in Houston is trying to become as large as Chicago. It's the fourth largest city in our country, and it's at 2.4 billion. I think Chicago is at 2.6 billion. Chicago is 2.7 billion, and Houston is seeking to claim, but they got all these other issues that they got to deal with in terms of transportation and communications and their distance and shipping and other costs that businesses would have. So Illinois has the wherewithal to be a very centrally located entity that helps our economic situation. And
Well, it's what you always talked about when you were running, Roland, is that location.
Location,
I mean, we're the crossroads of the nation. So
absolutely.
if you're the
More-
transportation
the more
hub of the
highway-
nation.
There are more highways crossing Illinois than any other state in the nation. And so, and what does that you see out in Will County, how those intermobiles and all those other corporations have now been using those facilities for shipping and distribution of their products.
So the other thing you mentioned earlier, Ralph, and I wanted to bring it up as well. So why is a graduated income tax better than what some Republicans are suggesting, which is a 5 to 15% cut in state spending?
Well, there's a lot of reasons why, and let's just talk about, first of all, what the state spends its money on and where we are in spending. So if you look at the Illinois General Fund, 96 cents out of every dollar the state spends on services goes to one of four things: education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. That's what we spend on. And if you look at our spending that's scheduled for FY 2021, the current fiscal year we're living in, and you adjust it for inflation and you compare it to fiscal year 2000, 20 years ago under Republican Governor George Ryan, we're going to spend 20% less on education, health, social services, and public safety this year than we did 2 decades ago. We've been cutting spending on services and in real terms and significantly for a long period of time, to the point where we're not coming anywhere near meeting demographically driven needs. So let's talk about education funding, K-12, for instance. K-12 funding has increased in the last 3 years because we have this new school funding formula, the evidence-based model, that creates a target for the state to increase school funding every year by about $300 million over the prior year. And it's done that. The prior 3 years, it's not going to do it this year because of COVID-19. All right. Despite that $900 million increase, our current level of K-12 funding, some $7 billion less than what the evidence-based model indicates is needed for every student to be able to walk into her or his neighborhood school and receive the kind of education which the research shows will give them an opportunity to achieve academic. Tied into the evidence of what works, we're $7 billion short. We're only going to fund K-12 education at $8.2 billion. We nearly need to double our current level of K-12 funding to get up to the level where the evidence indicates it needs to be to meet the needs of our children. So, okay, we're way short there. So let's assume we don't want to cut the heck out of K-12 funding. How about early childhood? Well, here's an area where even Governor Rauner supported increases and Governor Pritzker supported increases. And we're going to put in over $500 million into early childhood education this year. That's great, except the actual demand for early childhood services is over $3 billion. So once again, we're nowhere near meeting need. Higher education. We are going to provide $1.9 billion to higher education this year through the general fund, which is less in nominal, non-inflation adjusted dollars than the $2.2 billion it got in the year 2000. We've cut it in nominal terms. When you add in the impact of inflation, we've cut higher ed funding by over 48% in real terms since the year 2000. What has that meant? In 2002, state transfers to higher education covered over 72% of the cost of a student attending a public university in our state. Tuition and fees covered about 28%. After all these cuts, the last year I have numbers for is 2019, when there's final numbers on tuition and fees, et cetera. Tuition and fees were covering almost 70% of the cost of a student attending a public university, and state transfers were down to 32%. Our growth in tuition at our public institutions of higher learning has outstripped the national growth over this period of time by 50 percentage points. We are pricing public universities out of the pockets of middle income and low income working families. And of course, that has a disproportionately negative impact on Black and brown communities who are more clustered in the middle income and lower middle income earning areas and less clustered in the higher income earning areas. So it's classist and racist. Oh boy, really good policy, right? So you want to cut that some more? I don't think so. We're not meeting needs on human services, which are significantly down. So what's left? You want to cut Medicaid expenditures for low-income populations that need access to healthcare services during a pandemic? So all these people talk about cutting spending, first of all, don't really understand what the state spends its money on. Second, they haven't actually looked at the true spending trends and the cuts that have truly been implemented. And third, they don't really get the demographically driven demand for these services and how far below that demand we are. All that said, not even my main point, but it's a good one. My main point, cutting spending as a way to deal with a deficit during a recession worsens the length and breadth of your recession. Whereas raising taxes on really rich people and using that money to maintain your spending on services or increase it will actually grow your economy faster and help you recover quicker through a recession. And this isn't me talking. This is Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. And Stiglitz looked at what the different states did in response to the Great Recession, right? And he specifically found those states that did what we are trying to do, raise taxes progressively and use that to invest in these core services, recovered much faster than those states that cut spending. Now, why is that? And it goes back to my earlier discussion of the importance of consumer spending. So consumer spending is 67% of the economy. If you tax really rich people, they don't spend less. Why? Well, I gave you the numbers, right? In 1 year, the wealthiest 3% saw their incomes jump by $16 billion in their state. It's jumping by 12.4. That's not going to have them buy less hot dogs, okay? They're going to be fine. They're going to spend what they're going to spend. However, what we spend the money on is education, health, social services, and public safety that we raise. Well, what you're really spending the money on is the wages of the teachers and the social workers, of the healthcare providers, and the correctional officers online providing these services. Those are middle income workers. Those are good spenders. So the money we raise from folks who won't spend less becomes the income of people who will spend virtually every penny they earn. That creates a positive economic multiplier of up to $1.50 for every dollar so raised in taxes and spent on services. So that's a really good thing. If you cut spending on services, however, you're cutting the wages of teachers and social workers and healthcare providers. So they'll spend less. So your economy suffers. You get a negative multiplier. Your recession deepens and lengthens. So these people that talk about cuts and pretend as if they know what they're talking about from an economic standpoint need to pick up a book on macroeconomics and read it.
Well, now, Del Marie, I don't have the current figures, but I go back to the Walker administration. And of course, my 3 terms as state controller. And I will tell you in terms of what I could see in not being the chief executive, you could make those cuts and those changes. But I talked to Governor Blagojevich when we first got a Democratic governor of how we could make adjustments in the cost of government. And I was running for governor saying that we could cut out $500 million in waste. And in working with the Blagojevich staff in that first 4 years, there was $1 billion that was cut out because he inherited almost a $3.5 billion deficit. And how he closed that deficit was through the cut of state spending and consolidation of activities. For example, hundreds of millions of dollars were saved by combining buildings and facilities and the purchase of various equipment and items through state government. In the prison's budget, millions of dollars were saved through their purchasing and their types of what we call the joint purchasing. That's a term for it, which now slips my mind.
So in other words, processes versus people.
I'm sorry?
So in other words, processes versus people, which is what the Republicans are talking about.
Yeah, but see, the state government also, by the way, is the employer of last resort. And because they don't say it does exist, and that is hiring individuals in the patronage system. It's not supposed to exist anymore, but it does. And to some extent, I haven't been in the Illinois government for the last 20 years, so they might have cut down on some of that. But I know during my 20 years in the Illinois government, you would be more likely to add employees as a result of reducing employees. And why was that? Primarily because of demand of the citizenry. And people complain about the cost of government, but they do not know what is causing the cost of government, and that is human behavior. They are now creating situations where the government has to now try to respond to some type of activity that the citizens have created, and you have to create a law and then create a bureaucracy in order to try to solve that problem. And the taxpayers don't want to pay for that, but that is going to cost additional money. And this is where a lot of individuals get caught up in this thing, well, government is spending all this money. If human behavior would change, government could save you billions of dollars. That's the biggest problem. Human behavior.
So based on what you mentioned earlier, Ralph, and you too, Roland, there's a lot of skepticism, especially in the Black community, because when it comes to education, nobody wants to be against education. And one of the selling points the governor is using to why we should have a fair tax is that it will give more money to education. But the other part of that is, Roland, that's what we were told about the lottery. And so many people don't understand that at all. And you hear in the Black community all the time, well, I thought that's what the lottery was going to do, that it was going to pay for education. So using that as a talking point for the fair tax continues to create skepticism because we didn't see it with the lottery. So explain that in terms of why that didn't happen.
Now, Marie, in 1974, I was in the governor's cabinet when we put the lottery in. Governor Walker was the one that got the state lottery. And it was supposed to, of course, go for education. That one was said in terms of promoting the legislation. When the legislation got through the process of passing, there was no earmark or dollars put in for education. And so what happened was that the lottery kind of limped along for those 4 years that we were in there. And it got to the point in our last year, 1977, where the lottery had gone down in revenue, down to netting only about $28 million for the whole state, is what the state was netting on the lottery. And then we ended up saying, okay, we got to cancel. They were getting ready to cancel it. Then they had a young gentleman who was head of the lottery, his name was Mike Jones, who then took over the policy game. He came out with this game of the three to pick three numbers, and they took over policy, and that's when the lottery then began to really generate revenue substantially. But the lottery, for example, which was supposed to be used for education in my days, and these numbers are different. I'm quoting you some pretty old numbers, but the numbers that I know was the numbers that the lottery may have produced about grossly $1 billion. Well, 52% of those dollars are paid out in winnings. 8% is paid out in overhead. That means that 40% of the dollars will then go into the spending program for the operation of government. And that dollars did not amount to more than, in those days, $300 or $400 million. But we were spending $25 billion on secondary and elementary education. And the lottery was only producing a net of about 300 or 400 million. Now it's probably 600 or 700 million, where it's gotten up to because of the increases in the games and the inflationary rate. But lottery was never designed to solve the educational problem or any other problem, that because it couldn't produce enough revenue to do that. Our spending for education is so extensive for secondary and elementary education that it could not cover the spending for education. Even the gross amount wouldn't even generate the money. And that's get into another situation where we ended up with the Thompson then taking money that was supposed to go into the lottery, into the general fund, and it was taken out of wasn't going to the common school fund. So they had to pass legislation to say that the comptroller do not take the lottery money and put it in the lottery fund, transfer it to the general fund, and then transfer it to the common school fund. That's what we were doing initially. And they finally passed legislation that said all of the lottery money would go straight from the lottery fund into the common school fund. And therefore, it was supposed to go to rec. But what did the legislature do then when they ran into a need for financial services? They figured out what was going to go from the lottery fund into the common school fund. Let's say it was going to be 600 million. But what the legislature would do, what they would, in their appropriation process, would shave 200 or 300 million off of that, and they would not give education at 200 or 300 million, because they figured that that's what's going to come from the lottery. So that's how they got around all these instances to say that lottery was supposed to go to fund education.
So
Yeah,
Ralph,
so
go
we
ahead.
have a slightly different review of it. So the states had a structural deficit for a long period of time, which just means when you adjust for inflation, revenue growth isn't sufficient to maintain the same level of services from one year to the next. No new programs, no new spending, no expansion, just our money revenue growth doesn't keep pace with cost growth, period. That's simple. This has been going on in Illinois for generations. So when they passed the lottery, they passed it as a way to generate revenue. They sold it as something that would enhance education funding, but it never did. It became replacement revenue. So what happened was, to Roland's numbers, because his numbers on the amount of net revenue it generates sound accurate to me for sure. If the lottery put 600 million into the common school fund one year, then 600 million that used to go into the common school fund from the sales and income tax came out. And so education funding was never enhanced by the lottery. It was just existing funding was replaced. And they did that because of the structural deficit. They basically said, here's 600 million new net revenue. Okay, we'll put that into schools. That frees up 600 million that used to go to schools that we could now use for human services, right? So it was that kind of trade-off they made. And that gamesmanship was ended. Oh, I don't remember when they passed this legislation, but sometime.
95 was it? I think it was 95, wasn't it?
Well, no, the big gamesmanship was ended more recently, sometime between, I know what you're talking about in 95. They did a reform in 95, but that didn't stop the game, the
Okay.
shell game. Shell game was stopped like around 2011, 2012, maybe 2010. And what they basically said was, net funding from the lottery into the common school fund cannot result in any diminution of money that went into the common school fund the prior year from any source. So they
Yes, I
stopped the
remember that.
shell game.
Yes, yes.
The 95 resolution, I think you did a nice job, Roland, explaining how they got around that one. So
Yes.
that was an attempt to clean up the ball game, but they didn't quite get it done. So really the lottery money, for the most part, has always gone to fund education. There's the good news. The bad news is it didn't enhance it by a dime until recently when they stopped the shell game.
And please
And
tell
that-
Delmarie, I hope that the IBI listeners will please tell their colleagues that the lottery was not designed to save the state's financial problems. It could not, never even generate that much revenue. And based on that, you keep hearing it. You hear it on the radio today, well, they were supposed to pass the lottery, it's supposed to be for education. And sometimes I've gotten on the air with some of my old figures because I haven't kept up with the current figures since in the 2020s. But it never was designed, and it couldn't have done that because it didn't generate enough revenue.
So Ralph, and if you talk about that compared to what you worked on in terms of the passage of the evidence-based model of education funding 2 years ago, and tie that into the fair tax.
Yeah, so right, the challenge always with the evidence-based funding formula was we knew once we ran the model that the state would be way short of what the evidence indicated was needed. And so we wanted to create some bridges to help the state get in the mindset where they understood they had to enhance education funding in a meaningful way on a year-to-year basis. And so there were two target funding metrics put into the evidence-based funding model, and they were both subject to a lot of political discussion. Initially, the advocates of the legislation, so State Representative Will Davis and State Senator Kim Lightford, they were the two major legislative sponsors and advocates of the evidence-based funding model, wanted to see that funding increase annually by a minimum and had to between 5 and 750 million a year, 500 and 750 million a year. But legislative process, right? They needed Republican support. They needed Governor Rauner's support. So that number got negotiated down mostly by the Republicans and Rauner's office to be a target of 300 million a year. So it was no longer a minimum and it became a target. Now they met that target each of the first 3 years the bill was in place, fiscal years 2018, 19, and 20. This year, because of COVID-19, they're not going to. But there's a second item put in the bill by us diehards who believed in the legislation. And once again, Senator Lightford and Representative Will Davis get a lot of credit for this because they wouldn't budge on it in negotiations. We said, whether or not the target's made, we want this bill fully funded within 10 years from enactment. So here's the challenge, right? I mean, we're 7 billion short. And so on an inflation adjusted basis, to get to where we need to go, the state probably needs to be putting in close to $1 billion a year between now and 2028 to meet that challenge. More. It can't do that with its current fiscal system. However, the 3.6 billion from the fair tax goes a long way to providing some of the additional revenue needed to do this funding. I think Governor Pritzker was exactly right to say, this fair tax initiative is really one of the crucial tools we need in our kit if we're going to meet our obligations to fund the EBF. I think tying them together, I'm sure there was some political motivation in that, right? Because education is so popular politically, but I think a lot of it was just practical, doing math. We need the new revenue. We don't want to raise this revenue from low and middle income folks. We want to raise it only from affluent folks. And we've got some uses for it. And one of the big uses would be taking a portion of that 3.6 billion and using it to enhance education funding by more than 300 million every year. It probably won't get quite to the 900 million range. They probably won't get it done in 10 years. But even if they get to 500 million at 750 million, which there would be enough revenue to do with if this legislation passed on the fair tax, would make a difference, and we could get the EBF funded in, let's say, 12 to 15 years, which would be really good for our state.
Ralph, did they in any way then look at the pension fund deficit in any of these?
Well,
John,
not in those scenarios. So that's one of the other things the state needs to do. And I think Del Marie, if you want a whole new program on the pension, I could kill you on that. But here's the reality of the pension. So back in 1995, Governor Edgar got together with a guy named Speaker Madigan. You ever hear of him? I don't know if he's still around or not. But anyway, got together a guy named Speaker Madigan, and they passed responsible, and I'm putting that in air quotes, needs to be a pension funding law that basically said, look, our pension systems are significantly underfunded because we as a state decided to not put into them what the actuaries told us we should put into them every year as our contribution.
That started under Jim Thompson, okay?
Yeah, well, no, it didn't actually. You know, Roland, the first time we had a pension commission in Illinois because of underfunding our pensions, 1913. This is a venerable practice in our state.
Let me tell you how. Just interrupt you for this, because I then came in 79. In 1982, I issued a major report as state comptroller saying that our 5 pension funds were $9 billion underfunded. This is 1982. And by the time Thompson left office, the pension funds were at least 70 to 80 billion dollars underfunded because of how he played fast and loose with the pension money, not putting in the state dollars where they were supposed to fund them.
Well, the numbers weren't quite that big. So I think the total unfunded liability in 1995 was actually around $17 billion, but we were only 54% funded. So they doubled the unfunded liability in just a few years. And that did happen aggressively under Governor Thompson. But they passed this ramp in 1995, a 50-year payment plan, and they knew that they didn't have the money to fund it. So for the first 15 years of the plan, literally now by legislation, they just underfunded the pensions every single year and took the money that should have gone to the pensions to hide this structural deficit I keep talking about and pay it on services. Yeah, Roland, let me finish this point because it's complicated and then you could come in. So what happened was they intentionally blew up the unfunded liability from $17 billion to around 80 or 90 billion at the end of the sequence. And then we had the Great Recession and they lost a bunch of assets. And then we changed some accounting assumptions, actuarial assumptions that really matter, like the rate of return we anticipate getting on assets. We reduced that anticipated rate of return significantly, which once again, blew up the unfunded liability to where it is today at around 139, 140 billion dollars. Now, the way the ramp was designed is all of a sudden magically in the late 2000s, think now, we would have this money that would grow tremendously to go into the pensions to pay this debt from the intentional growth of the unfunded liability. We don't. And I'll show you how crazy that debt service grows. Between last fiscal year 2000 and this fiscal year 2021, just the amount of debt that we owe the pension system grew by 500 million. That's how much more we had to pay. Our total general fund revenue grew by 100 million. So the debt service that we had to pay to our pension system grew by 5 times the revenue growth we had in our entire fiscal system. And the total payment is now over 9 billion. In out years, it approaches $20 billion. And it grows like a ski slope. We just can't afford this. And so to get our fiscal house in order on the pensions, we really do need to re-amortize this pension debt, flatten out the payments, put more in upfront than what the ramp currently requires, and then level out the payments at an amount our fiscal system can handle. We've got a couple of reports on this available online at the CTBA. The sooner they do it, though, the better, because if you want to live with this pension ramp deadline of 2045, 50 years from 1995, and there's no reason to live with that, but they are. The magic of compounding interest means the longer you wait to solve the problem, the more expensive it gets to solve. So if they'd have implemented our plan 2 years ago, we could have cut costs to taxpayers by $67 billion between now and 2045 and still got the pension system healthy. And if they do it today, we could only save you $45 billion. That's the power of compounding interest. And now, we first proposed this in the middle 2000s, like 2005 or 6. And at that time, the total payment into the pensions to cover normal cost and the debt service would have been about $4 billion a year, flat dollar, all the way through. Now it needs to be about $12 billion. So you can see waiting is a bad thing. And they've waited too long. But that's one of the other fiscal steps they have to take.
Well, we've actually stolen your report over the years for my clients, so I know about your report very well. We want to make sure that we open up this for the viewers so that they can ask you some questions. And I think Joseph is available. Are you with us yet, Joseph?
Yes, I am.
Okay, good, good. So Joseph, you can now be the moderator in terms of taking some of these questions that we can have Ralph and Roland answer.
All right. Thank you, both of you, Ralph and Roland. I am the state chair of IBI IPO, and we're going to open the floor up to some questions. You can either raise your hand or you can put it in the chat and I will read it. So the first hand I saw go up was Alan's.
So I have two quick questions for Ralph. Number one is, the governor set up a commission of legislators to look at reducing local property taxes, feeling that the fair tax would provide more income, basically for education. Do you see that ever happening? Number one. And number two is, when you talk about the fair tax legislation not impacting pensions, that's obviously 100% true. The question is, if now we have a graduated income, would make it easier for legislators to say we're going to tax pensions, let me finish, tax pensions for only over $100,000.
Because they could do that today, Alan. So
Well, I know they can do it, but
no, they could even do it on a graduated basis today. So let me explain why it doesn't
Okay.
make it any easier. The reason pension income is not subject to the income tax is the state passed a law creating a full deduction for all retirement income. They have every right to modify that law and say you could only deduct your first 50,000 of retirement income and everything else is taxable.
Right.
You know what I mean? Or you could deduct, and they could even graduate that. So it absolutely, I just want to be as clear as I can. This legislation, this graduated rate structure create absolutely no new right or authority to tax retirement income in any way or form that does not exist today. So they could even do it on a graduated basis today. I actually did a debate against a guy from the AEI and Wire Points on this, where they were making the point you just asked, right? Well, doesn't it make it easier? And they said, well, yes, it does. Yes, it does. And I said it didn't. I said, all right, guys, I just looked at them during the debate. I said, you need to tell me what new legal authority, cite me to it. And they looked at each other, and then they looked at me, they go, well, legally, you're right. I said, that's right. I'd much rather be legally right than wrong. So I'm just 100% convinced that that's a scare tactic. And I could tell you, we've even made, my organization thinks some retirement income should be taxed. We think the exclusion is too large, but we think it should only be done on a graduated basis at higher levels of, and we came up with proposals in the past, and that's when we were stuck with a flat rate structure. Actually, with a graduated rate structure, we may never have to tax retirement income in Illinois because there's so much wealth in the top of our state that you don't need to look at it. If we had a flat rate, I think you would. So that answers that part of the question. Your other question on property taxes, I think, is brilliant and it's spot on. And here's why. Illinois is a low tax state overall, and I'll give you the numbers. If you look at every tax and fee charged by any unit of state or local government in Illinois as a percentage of income in our state versus every tax and fee charged by every other state in their states as a percentage of income in their states, we rank 33rd in total state and local tax burden as a percentage of income. That's bottom third, despite having the 5th highest economy and the 6th largest population. Property taxes, we rank 3rd in the country when you isolate the property tax. So we are a high property tax state. The reason for that, and the sole reason for that, is the state of Illinois' decision to address that structural deficit I keep talking about, where revenue doesn't grow at a pace that will allow you to keep providing the same services from one year to the next, in part by shifting the primary obligation to fund the K through 12 education away from state taxes and down to local property taxes. And so let me give you the numbers. in a typical state, local property taxes only cover about 45% of the cost of public education. In Illinois, they cover 67%. That is the most highest, biggest, number one reliance on property taxes in the nation to fund schools. When you flip it to the next category, state-based taxes. On average, in a typical state, state-based taxes like income and sales, et cetera, cover 46% of the cost of public education. In Illinois, they only cover 24%. That's last, that's 50th. So the reason we have high property taxes in Illinois is we have a structural deficit that has forced the state or encouraged the state to push the primary obligation for funding K-12 education away from state taxes and down to local property taxes, which means the only way to actually sustainably get to property tax relief over time is to get the state the fiscal capacity to do an adequate job of funding education from state-based revenue and flip these percentages. So the good news is the graduated rate revenue from the graduated rate income tax will help us get there, but I don't sell snake oil. The bad news is it's not going to happen overnight. It'll take a good 5 to 7 years to see a meaningful difference. However, this is the only way to solve the problem sustainably.
And Ralph,
That's a great question, Alan.
where the Constitution, the state of Illinois has this statement in there that the state of Illinois should be primarily responsible for the cost of education. And that has been a major debate as to what the word primary, primary responsible mean. And someone says that the state should be paying as much as 51% of the cost of education, and it's gone as low as 30 to 31% that the state is putting for the cost of education.
It's actually down to 24 now, Roland. And
okay, yeah. That's what it was in my days, okay?
But here's the thing about that. We have pretty well settled constitutional law in that we've had 2 different cases.
Right.
And they've read the language in the Constitution to be quote unquote merely hortatory. That means advisory.
Yes.
So our constitutional language does not create any enforceable right. So it's merely advisory. And we have really bad dicta, actually. In one of the cases, and it might be the Edgar case, one of the justices said, yeah, and you know, the way I read this language, the primary obligation to fund education means the primary obligation to set up a system by which education gets funded. They did that. It relies on property taxes. Go away. And so, you know, I mean, the bottom line is we have really, really bad constitutional law here, and we can't fall back on that. We have to solve this problem in the legislature.
Thank you,
Ralph. Move to the next question. Alan, are you satisfied?
Maybe.
Okay, good enough.
Only because the longer the state doesn't have money for funding education, the more uneven funding is. So when Nutria raises, I don't know, $20,000 a student, and the south and west side of Chicago is maybe $6,000 a student, we're continuing the disparity in education for the citizens of our state, especially those who probably need it the most.
You'll be happy to know, Alan, that under the new evidence-based funding formula, 89% of the new revenue that has gone into K-12 education, 89% of that 900 million has gone to the school districts that are furthest away from adequacy. So the new funding formula has a distribution model that actually specifically redresses the old equity problems created by our old system. That said, we can't get to a completely equitable distribution until we get off this addiction of property taxes. We can't do that with our current tax policy. So it all comes back to tax policy in a lot of ways at the end of the day. Inadequate resources on the front end means inadequate outcomes on the back end, period, end of story.
Thank you.
All right, Betty, you have a question?
I do. Assuming that the fair tax will pass, and it does not appear based on what you're saying, that really is going to be the be all end all, what is the possibility of Illinois passing a transaction tax, which
Zero.
works in New York? It does work in New York, and what is the reason why we just refuse to even consider it?
New York actually doesn't assess a transactions tax. They have it on the books, but they don't actually assess it. Their tax rate is 0.
And,
So-
and the corporations probably move out of Chicago or move out of Illinois because of the computer system. The transaction tax can be done
Yeah.
by anybody, by any source, and they'll take it to South Dakota or North Dakota.
And in fact, that's been the actual experience in Europe, in some European nations that have tried this, that have close proximity to other nations, like Sweden saw a major loss of its financial markets and stock trading after they passed the transactions tax. Now, at the national level, it would work in America because we're so big and our markets are so important. I would volunteer to draft the legislation for Congress, but I would oppose it in Illinois. It would make us an outlier. It wouldn't work. It'd be easy to evade. And so there's a lot of sound economic and tax policy reasons why at a state level, a financial transactions tax does not.
They tried to get Chicago to pass a transaction tax, for its
Stop.
local deficit, and it would be devastating to that transaction economy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Carol Ziegeldorf?
Yes, Ralph, I know you said that we lose a lot of people in Illinois to higher tax states. But in addition to the high property taxes we pay here in Illinois, we also pay one of the highest sales taxes. And do you see this going up?
I
Or
can't hear her.
I can barely hear her, Del Marie.
But it was about the sales. She said, in addition to us paying a higher property tax, we're one of the states that has a higher sales tax.
Our rate. So our average rate. So let's just talk about the way the sales tax rate breaks down. And I'm going to go tax policy nerd on you. There are two parts of a tax. Its rate and its base, and they both matter in creating tax burden. So let's talk about the rate part first. Our rate at the state level is 5%. And then local governments get a 1.25% add-on. So no matter where you are in Illinois, the sales tax rate is at least 6.25%. And then in places like City of Chicago, Cook County, it's much higher because home rule authorities can add on. Certain school districts can do a voluntary sales tax add-on. So as it turns out, statewide, the weighted average of the sales tax in Illinois is about 8.69%, 8.7%, which is in the top 10 of the nation. So our rate is high. However, we have the most narrow sales tax base of any state in America. That means of the 45 states with a sales tax, we tax less economic activity with our sales tax. And the reason for that is our sales tax applies primarily to the sale of goods, hard physical things you could touch, like clothing and desktops and, things you could touch, and not services like haircuts, lawn care, auto repair, labor services, those things. Well, goods are only about 17% of the Illinois economy right now. Services are over 70%, which means when you put it all together, even though our rates on the sales tax are relatively high, we collect less in sales tax revenue per capita than any other state in America. So it's because our base is so small. So
Surprised on that, Ralph. You seem a little surprised on that comment that you just made.
Yeah, well, but the numbers are the numbers are the numbers,
Right,
and so that's the reality. And so we actually did a report a few years back with the very conservative pro-business taxpayers foundation and federation. You know them, Roland, the
Yes.
pretty conservative group. And we co-authored a report that said all the reasons why the state of Illinois needs to expand its sales tax base to include consumer services, just to modernize the tax code. And that could lead to some reductions in rate at the local levels. But I tell you right now, even though our rates are high, our sales tax burden is the lowest in the country.
Okay, are there any other questions on the floor right now?
So what I'd like to know, Ralph, is what happens if the amendment fails?
Well, our fiscal, do you like what we've been having? Because it's going to be more of the same, right? I mean, so our fiscal problems are.
They're going to raise the income tax.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, our problems aren't going to go away on their own, right? So if we don't get the opportunity to raise taxes in a way that focuses only on the wealthiest who could afford it, they're going to have to raise taxes on everyone.
On everybody.
And that's just the truth. And that's not a happy truth, but it's the truth. And honestly, it's one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't choices. And here's why. If they don't raise the revenue, maybe a middle income family saves $150, $250 a year in taxes that they're not going to pay, but their schools for their children will remain woefully underfunded. The human services provided in their community to seniors and adults with developmental disabilities and abused and neglected children will not be able to meet need. There won't be adequate, healthcare services. In other words, the cost to low and moderate income families of underfunding services from an economic standpoint is significantly greater than what even a regressive tax would charge them. So it's by far and away the lesser of evils to do the regressive tax increase. We would prefer, my organization would like to see a progressive tax increase where the rich finally pay their fair share. Because I'll tell you, here's the real challenge in tax policy. If you took my class, now I hope all of you want to sign up for Roosevelt University's master course on public budgeting. I'd love to welcome you all in, except Roland, you know too damn much, so you can't come. But the rest of you all can. And here's the challenge. Here's the challenge. Wherever your needs are greatest, your resources are least. That's the truth. So you need some way through your tax policy to raise money from people and areas of wealth so you have adequate resources to invest in areas of need. Illinois can't do that with its current tax policy because the only tax that could do that is the income tax, and then only if it has a graduated rate structure. And that's why this amendment is so important. We got to change this constitution to allow a graduated rate structure so that we could finally raise some revenue from people who could afford it and invest it in providing services to people who need it. It's that simple.
Yeah, we have another question from Carol. Carol, go ahead. And then Betty.
I lived in Minnesota for a year, and they didn't tax food and they didn't tax clothing. Anything you eat, they did not tax, and they did not tax clothing on your back. How did they do it?
Well, Minnesota's top income tax rate is 9.85%, and it kicks in at only $160,000 of income. And our top rate under the fair tax would be less, 7.99%, and it would kick in at $750,000 of income if you're single, million if you're married filing jointly. Number two, their sales tax base includes services, haircuts, lawn care, bowling, auto repair. So they still generate a lot more with their sales tax than we do with ours, and they significantly more on a per capita basis than we do. They're a much smaller state than us. Minnesota has a population about the size of Cook County, but if you look at it on a per capita basis to apply apples to apples, they're a much higher tax state than us.
Roland, do you have anything to comment on her question?
No, I said it. I'm okay. Thanks, John.
All right.
I have a question. This is Aviva Cat from IBIPO.
Aviva?
And that is the...
Aviva, can you hold on? Betty,
Yes.
I just wanted to make one comment. When you talked about personnel, all of those people who think that the state is spending too much money on personnel found out that because of the recidivism rate, they did not hire people when they retired. That's why people had a problem getting their unemployment, because there was nobody to answer the phones because all of the people that had left, they did not replace them. And there was actually a shortage in that department, so sometimes we get what we ask for.
Yeah, Betty, you're exactly.
And you're absolutely correct on that, Betty. And that's when you got to balance that employment situation of where you have your staffing and where you don't. And I've spent 20 years in the Illinois government. I could tell you where the bodies were buried in my days because I've been gone there from 20 years. So there might be a different story.
So it's more bodies.
More bodies?
Yeah.
But Betty's absolutely correct. And you have to know where you're going to have your leverage point and where you have patronage. For instance, in the Department of Transportation, you know, in terms of those areas where, and having run state general services for 4 years, you're actually the administrator of state government in my days. And I'm talking about the 70s and 80s now. And I could tell you where all the problems were, because under my governor, I had the responsibility to consolidate a lot of that. We had individuals that were 4 or 5 levels down in the department that had a car. Everybody didn't need an automobile in state government. And I came in, I took it over 600 or 700 automobiles when I was director of general services. And the printing operation, every state government had their own printing press. And, you know, I consolidated the printing operation into one area.
Well, it goes back to what you said earlier, Roland, about behavior. And so that's what Betty's talking about.
Let me tell you what the biggest expense was. And it's still good. They use it now. It's called the Pony Express. Have you all heard of the Pony Express? That was put in place by me in 1974 when mail was being mailed in Springfield from the state office building to the Springfield post office to across the street to the state capitol. That's what they were doing in Springfield. And I began to assess this. And don't talk about the mail that was being mailed from Springfield to Chicago with postage. Betty, I set up what we call a mail-in messenger system. And we had about 5 employees in Chicago, at least 3 in Springfield. And we picked up the mail on routes, put it in a truck at 5 o'clock in Springfield, a truck at 5 o'clock in Chicago, and they switched in Pontiac. And that Springfield mail would go on back to Springfield with the Springfield driver taking that truck, and Chicago mail would go back to Chicago, the Chicago driver taking that truck. We saved in 1975, Betty, over $1 million in postage.
Wow.
I mean, you know, that just shows you how you could move in to cut out some of this areas of space. Dan Walker gave me the green light to do this. And that's the reason why we were funding schools at 48% of the cost of education when we left office in 1977. And then, of course,
Roland, we've got one more question.
Okay.
We have Aviva. Aviva?
Yes, thank you. One of the disappointments of the legislation of the rates is that this tax cut, even though, yes, 97% of the people get it, is really insignificant. It's almost nothing. And I assume that there was some political reason for them to do it that way. So my question is, what would it take for us to be able to get to truly cut those rates to bring, let's say, the bottom rate back to 3%, or maybe have an intermediate rate of 4% on people who earn less than the median income? What would have to happen on the high side? Would we be able to do that without exceeding the states in which we appear to be in competition? Because I presume that that's the reason that they didn't come up with a higher rate like Minnesota.
You know, Aviva, it wasn't even as much political as it was math driven. They needed 3.6 billion in new revenue, and they wanted to provide tax relief to as many people as they could. So this is where that equation came out. My organization actually did a lot of the modeling. We didn't do the, you know, they picked their own final rate structure. We gave them a bunch of the modeling, and they looked at a number of different alternatives. And I have always said this bill is not about cutting taxes. This bill is about raising new revenue in a fairer way. And so they could invest in core services. And I don't think they could get to anywhere near providing meaningful tax relief to low and moderate income families unless they do both of the other fiscal things I was talking about: re-amortize the pension debt, expand the state sales tax base to include consumer services. And then what I would do is develop a significant refundable tax credit for low and moderate income families. We had designed one before. I don't know if you remember the old legislation we pushed with Reverend Senator Meeks called HB 750. It was a school funding bill that had some tax increases involved.
He was the Senate, leader of the Senate.
He was the leader of the Senate. We were his technical advisor. Meeks is a character of all characters. I love Reverend Meeks, I just do. But we had a tax credit that was fully refundable that went up to people earning up to $75,000 a year, depending on family size. And we provided pretty meaningful relief through that. I think it was about $2 billion. So you can do it, and not with our current fiscal condition. They need the revenue, and they just can't afford to do meaningful tax relief. And I'll tell you what, like I said before, that's one of those situations where if you're a low or moderate income earner, it would be great to have the tax relief, $100 more, $200 more, $300 more. That's meaningful. That said, having a fully funded school for your kid is more meaningful. Having lower tuition costs at institutions of higher learning is more meaningful. Ensuring that all abused and neglected children have adequate caseworkers to care for their needs is more meaningful. Having adequate amounts of money being invested in providing childcare for single working low-income parents is more meaningful. So it's a balancing act at this point, Aviva, and it's one where their fiscal condition really doesn't allow them to provide meaningful tax relief. But if they do these couple of other reforms, they can get to that point. And we would certainly be right in the middle of pushing that to happen.
Okay, thank you very much.
I'm just trying to give you honest answers, no snake oil.
I am going to allow our partner, Ida's Legacy Committee, Del Marie, to have the last word. However, I wanted to say briefly, thank you for coming out tonight. I want to thank Roland and Ralph for participating. And then for all of the IVI, IPO members, next Tuesday, our membership committee is planning to have a Zoom called Vote and Unwind, not with a D, but with an E. Unwind. So everybody should be have a glass of wine in their hand to watch the returns come in. With that, I am.
May I just say something to close up? I just want to thank Ralph for these current numbers that he presented, because I dealt with these over the years, and I've been off to Washington and everywhere else. And I think we owe him a great deal of recognition in terms of his knowledge and work in this whole area. So Ralph, keep up the good work and hang in there, if I could say.
Well, thanks for that, Roland. And I haven't done nearly as much as you did with your life dedicated to public service. So I think the kudos need to come right back at you, my friend. And so I appreciate everything you've done for the state of Illinois.
Well, I like both of you because you are nerdy. And when I want to talk policy, I know where to go.
Del Marie's beat up on me so much, so you know. She know who to get, right?
Exactly. And so I want to thank you all for joining us this evening, and we hope we gave you one more reason to vote and encourage everyone you know to vote and to vote for the fair tax. And remember, November 3rd is not the first day of voting. It's actually the last day of voting. And we want you to make sure to get your mail-in ballots in the mail this week. Early voting is underway throughout the entire state. And if you plan to wait until Election Day, be sure to wear a face covering, do your homework, and on the judges, because when you get into that polling place, we want you to vote from the top of the ballot to the bottom of the ballot, because judges are very, very important. And you don't get to the judges and then decide, oh, I don't know these people, I'm not going to vote for them. No, you need to know them. And so make sure you do your homework and take your cheat sheet with you into the polling place, and make sure you do it at home as well. And we thank you so much for joining us. And I hope that our viewers learned a little bit more about the fair tax and why it's so needed. And we dispel some of the myths that are taking place in the political ads that we're seeing every day. So good night, and we appreciate you joining us. Thank you, Roland. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you so much for joining us. If you liked what you saw today, go ahead and like the video down below and also subscribe to the channel so you can get notified about whenever we put out new videos about new topics that are interesting to the world that you live in. Thank you.